Time to step up, a big step. Something with more room, big enough for 5 people, plenty of fuel and baggage all at once. She's got to go faster, higher and farther, and safer than anything before her. 2 engines, and we need a decent single-engine climb capability, a special kind of efficiency. She's got to cruise over 200 knots and just sip fuel. We'll keep her light, and she can climb over 2,500 feet a minute. At full gross, with 5 crew and baggage, she'll still climb over 1,800 feet a minute at 120 knots. She'll be a fun airplane and safe. Just doesn't make sense that any pilot in a twin should ever have to worry about handling an engine out. If she loses an engine, then she's got to give the pilot good performance, as if she were a single-engine aircraft. She'll be pretty in her own way, a different way. That's the ticket. 5 adults, fuel, and baggage. She should be able to cruise over 1,400 nautical miles. And if she loses an engine, either engine, she's got the ability to keep on going at 10,000 feet. And if necessary, to take off on one engine or to go around either engine. Anything else just doesn't make sense. We can expect a drag area of 2.8 square feet, a wingspan of 31 feet. Got to keep the weight down. She'll be a trim lady with muscle. No doubt about that. Nothing like her. Never before. Nothing ever built like her. That looks like her or flies like her. She'll defy everything that came before her.
off, taxiing out to take off. Give me your winds and runway information, please.
8 Romeo Alpha, surface with Mojave or light and variable out of the west. Favorite runway is 7.
Fine, 8 Romeo Alpha, thank you.
purpose of this tape is to show you a flight test procedure, how to check out and how to flight test a brand new home-built airplane, in this case the Long Easy. We're going to go through and give you an abbreviated look at the full procedure that's in the Long Easy Owner's Manual and show you several of the major steps that are used to check an airplane out, do the taxi testing, and everything through the first flight. The initial systems checkout consists of going through the airplane and checking every system very thoroughly. You check all the fasteners, all the control systems, all the nuts and bolts, making sure that you have at least 2 threads showing on all the bolts outside the lock nuts, making sure that everything is tight. You check carefully the incidence of the Canard by using the Canard incidence template. This is a simulation of one here. And the airplane is leveled, and you accurately check to make sure the water line is exactly the same, cord line is exactly the same water line as the longeron reference. You also do that in 2 places on the main wing to make sure that the main wing is at the right incidence and the right twist. You then check the elevator position, and this is done by using a angle protractor and working the controls, checking from the 0 reference, and then moving the elevator up and checking for the 20 degrees plus or minus 2, back to the down position, 22 degrees plus or minus 2.
22.
Okay. You check the Canard attachment bolts for security and tightness. Make sure the right number of threads are showing. Make sure that the Canard lift tab is in the shank of the bolt. The nose gear actuation, the worm gear drive, check for proper lubrication, tightness and security of all the bolts, tightness and security of the electrical system, also correct operation of the gear warning micro switch, and also the nose gear pivot. You should have to push at least 2 pounds sideways so that you have adequate friction to keep the nose gear from shimmying. The main gear, where's the master switch here? The main gear warning system can be checked by turning on the master switch and backing off slightly on the nose gear and check for the warning. There we go. Moving back to the airplane, you check the wing attachment bolts for security. We'll cover a little later the engine area where you'll check all of the systems in the engine compartment. Okay, moving out to the ailerons, you should operate the controls from the cockpit and have the observer on the angle measuring, apply a light air load to it to back it off for air loads, and then check for plus or minus 20 degrees of aileron throw. On the rudder, I'll actuate the rudder pedal up here to full travel, and Mike will apply a load and check for the correct deflection of the rudder.
That's good.
One of the main items to check on the airplane is the canopy, the hinges for security and tightness, the safety catch, which backs up the canopy latch should the pilot forget to operate it, the security of the 3 latches that are on the canopy, and the correct operation and engagement of the canopy latches that pull the canopy down. The pilot should sit inside and pull the canopy down and make sure that the canopy snubs firmly against these sponge seals as it pulls down, and that provides the spring and the firmness of the canopy in its latch. You also check the canopy warning micro switch to make sure that it's operating properly. If the canopy latch is not fully engaged, the warning should come on. On the fuel system, should check the operation of the fuel valve to make sure that it takes no more than a 10-pound force to operate. You should fuel the airplane one side at a time and fuel it in 2-gallon increments so that you can calibrate the fuel sight gauges on the sides. You should run the engine or pour fuel from the gascolator when you're selecting just the left-hand side after you've filled only the left to make sure that the valve is oriented properly, that it is indeed selecting the left. Then select the right tank and assure by draining that you are getting fuel from the right tank. You should flush the entire fuel system to get contaminants out of it, and then recheck and redo the gascolator strainer after that time. The next checks we're going to look at is the power plant installation. You should clock the propeller for compression at the 10 o'clock position for proper hand propping. He's coming up on compression there. It's very important that you torque the propeller bolts for the proper torque on the wood propeller. And make sure that the spinner is tight and secure, and check the torque of all of its screws. Should check the propeller track to make sure that each blade is the same distance from the a wing reference, and rotate the blade 180 degrees and measure that the track should be within a 1/16 of an inch on track. Should check the engine mount bolts for proper safetying and security. Check the oil level in the engine. You should have someone operate the mixture, throttle, and carburetor heat controls from the cockpit and check for proper function. Also check for proper function with the springs removed, because the springs are there for fidelity and not for reliability. You should check the magneto wiring, make sure the magneto timing is correct. Check that the cowling baffles must fit tight all around the engine and the cowl and are properly installed and secure. One of the most important items of checkout is the determination of the weight and balance of the airplane. This must be accurately done. The airplane is unsafe to fly. Any airplane is unsafe to fly unless the CG is in the correct place. Knowing the weight of the airplane and knowing the CG of the airplane before flight is extremely important. The weighing should be done inside where the winds won't affect the scale readings. And we're going to go over some of the items here that are required to do the weight and balance. Generally, 3 platform scales are best. In this case, we are using an accurate platform scale and 2 separate platforms which are exactly the same height as the platform scales. And we're going to be shuffling the platform scales between the wheels, and with these exactly the same height, the airplane will sit at the right level for each weighing. It's extremely important that you use an accurate platform scale, not a bathroom scale. It's extremely important that it be positioned so that the gear leg, as it springs out, will allow the scale to roll. If you use a bathroom scale or another not accurate scale, you can get weighings which are critically off, and you could be flying at an unsafe CG position. You also need to level the airplane an accurate level. The airplane must be level during the weighing. And to determine the airplane's plan form, to determine where the wheels are located and where the wings are located relative to the wheels, which is just as important as the wings themselves, you'll need a plumb bob and a tape measure, and you'll need also a chalk line so that you can draw a straight line on the floor, and we'll show the use of that later on. The first procedure in the weight and balance that we're going to cover is the definition of the airplane's geometry by measuring where the wings are relative to the wheels and where the wings are relative to the fuselage reference. In this case, for this airplane, the fuselage reference being the front edge of the instrument panel bulkhead. First of all, the airplane must be level. So we put a level on the longerons, which is the reference for level, and Mike is reaching in and he's going to lower the nose gear until the airplane comes exactly level. The airplane has been ballasted, so it'll sit in a 3-point attitude. Good. Okay, now that the airplane's level, we're going to be very, very careful not to roll it or move it as we go around and use the plumb bob to define the geometry of the airplane. We'll start out by the reference, which is fuselage station 40, and that's measured by dropping the plumb bob right to the front edge of the instrument panel. That's the forward edge of the instrument panel. And we may make a correction on that depending on where the wings are later on. So Mike is making a mark on the floor. And now we're going to go over and define the leading edge of the canard. And this is done just by bringing the plumb bob and letting it drape over the leading edge of the canard and bring it down to the floor, and Mike will stabilize it and make an X on the floor where the leading edge of the canard is. Now, he'll use the plumb bob to define the position of the nose gear. This is very important because the weight of the nose gear times the position of the nose gear is the data that's used to find the CG of the airplane. So he's putting a mark on the floor at the fuselage station of the nose gear. Working back to the main gear, again being careful not to move the airplane in the meantime, we'll drop off the center line of the axle and document the main gear position. Now each one of these measurements will be repeated on the right side of the airplane, and we'll show you what we do with both of those later on. Also, we come off the leading edge of the wing at butt line 56 to document its position. Notice it's very important that this is not done outside with the wind blowing, because it can disrupt the readings. Then, to check the sweep of the wing and the wing's position, we come off of the out here at butt line 156 before the radius starts, and we document the position of the wing tip. Action. Okay, now that we've repeated all those measurements and lines on the right side, we're going to also put some center lines down, and this is done by running a chalk line off of the nose of the airplane and putting a mark on the floor. And we've also run one off the tail of the airplane at the spinner. So now what we do is push the airplane out of the way so that we can run the chalk lines and take our measurements. And it's done this way. Let's go up here to where the marks are for the leading edge of the canard. Oh, first of all, we'll put the center line down. We'll get it tight on the center line and make a chalk line. Then we'll go across all of the measurements for the nose gear, leading edge of the canard, the bulkhead, and the aft wing, as well as the main gear. Okay, here's the two canard leading edge points. Whoops. Put them down. Run the chalk line. Here's the nose gear. And here is the fuselage station 40 bulkhead. And that 40 is a tentative number now. We may change it depending on where the wings end up. And now we go back to the main gear, which is here. We'll put the chalk line down for the main gear. And for the leading edge of the wing, and out at the wing tip. Okay. Now we have several lines which intersect the center line of the airplane, and our job now is to take all the measurements of those. And we'll start by making them all relative to the fuselage station reference, which is the instrument panel. So our next job is to measure carefully from this reference to the nose gear, to the leading edge of the canard, and then back from that reference to the main gear, the leading edge of the wing, and the leading edge of the wing tip. And we'll write all these numbers into the owner's manual, and from that calculate to see if the reference is in the correct position. If the reference is not in the correct position, we will move it to the most representative position to its relationship to the canard and to the main wing. These numbers also will now tell us the fuselage station of the nose gear and the fuselage station of the main gear, and those are the numbers that we will use when we calculate the weight and balance. after we get the scale readings for the weight. Okay, now we have identified and justified the geometry of the airplane, identified and verified the position of the fuselage station 40 reference. Now what we're going to do is put the airplane up on the scales and weigh it. I'm going to lift this edge and Mike will slide the platform under the right side. That's good. And he's chalking it now so it doesn't move. It's important to have some help with this. Now we'll lift the other side, and let's see, we should put that a little further on to it, Mike. Okay. Okay. Now we'll lift the other side and get the scale under it. It's important to put the scale in from the side. It's important to put the scale in from the side so that the gear spring will let the scale roll on its wheels so that there's no friction. Okay, once the airplane is up onto the scale and the platforms, re-verify that the fuselage is level. Must be perfectly level for the attitude of the weighing. Verify that the nose gear is straight, and then go ahead and weigh the airplane. We're getting the left main gear weight now. And these weighings will be repeated for the right main gear and for the nose gear, merely by lifting the airplane up and swapping the platform to the platform scales. After the weighings are done, you should pull the scale out and get a tear reading to see what the scale weighs when there's nothing on it, or if you've left a chalk on there to weigh that part of the chalk. That's good. And recall the position in the airplane of any ballast that you put in for keeping it level. And recall the fuselage station of that ballast so you can use the data for calculating the weight and balance. That's really all there is to a weight and balance. There is some calculations to go. You must put in the data in the owner's manual, in the tables, and make the appropriate calculations. Another major thing that you should not leave out is a complete equipment list. You should write down what radio and what instruments and what seat cushions and seat belts and just everything in the airplane that is possible that later you may remove or later that you may add to, so that you know that the weight and balance is current for that specific list of equipment. If you later on add a spinner or wheel pants, you can take the weight of those times their fuselage station and put that in as a moment and add their weight to the empty weight and thus recalculate a center of gravity position and a new gross weight. Owner's Manual Appendix 2, Flight Test Procedures. As you complete the final checkout of your new airplane, you're going to be hot to fly your first flight. You may push a little too hard at the last minute and try to fly prematurely, possibly with something wrong with your airplane. To avoid this home builder syndrome, give the only key to your bird to a close friend and give the absolute authority to say go or no go to your initial flights to him. With all the other things you are thinking about, it's best to give the decision of whether the airplane is ready to someone else. If you really get a bad case of home builder syndrome, your friendship may be strained somewhat, but you'll be able to make up after you've tested your new bird safely. A little champagne seems to help. This home builder syndrome has been a major factor in many first flight accidents. Typical of this problem is where an individual spends all of his time and money building his airplane and for several years lets his flying proficiency lapse. Very typically, we find a finished home built with the owner pilot seriously lacking in pilot proficiency. In one case, the pilot who tried to fly the first flight on his home built had only one flight in the last 2 years. Another problem surfaces about this time the airplane is ready to fly, and that's called ego. I built the machine, I'll fly it. After all, who knows more about this machine than me? I built it. The home builder is understandably proud of his creation and becomes very possessive. So we find a proud builder pilot at the end of a runway ready for takeoff with possibly a bad case of home builder syndrome. But he won't know it until just after liftoff, when he finds himself suddenly thrust into an environment where he is ill prepared to handle. His proficiency is not good. The best remedy for home builder syndrome is to accept help on your flight testing from an experienced, long easy or very easy pilot. Then, afterwards, when you know your airplane is in good shape, get a good checkout from him after you meet the currency requirements. Don't just race out and fly your airplane the first time. You'll spend a while checking out all the systems on the ground before you leap off on the first flight. The first order of business is to check out your engine system thoroughly. Ground run it for an hour or so at low to medium power with a cowling off. After checking your engine system thoroughly, you should run the engine on the ground for an hour or so at low to medium power. Carefully monitor temperatures. Run it with the cowling off so that you can look for any indication of excessive vibration, unsafetied hardware, leaky fuel lines, or anything else unpleasant. Carefully monitor fuel readings, cylinder head temperatures, oil temperatures while the airplane's running on the ground, and check each cylinder. Don't let the engine overheat. You can run your engine a few minutes at a time at low power setting, and it should not overheat in this position. After the initial run-in period, check everything over very carefully. Recheck your valve covers, recheck the exhaust nuts for torque, look for leaks around the all gaskets, loose clamps, check the fit of the cowling baffles, check each nut that you can see and make sure that it's torqued up again and not loose. Be sure the engine compartment is clean. Check for nuts, washers, bits of safety wire, and so on, because in a pusher everything that comes off goes right through the prop. After your initial runs, you should check the screen of the gascolator and check the screen inside the carburetor bowl and pull the bowl off and check for any contamination in the carburetor bowl. After everything looks perfect, you should be then ready to go ahead and put the cowling on the airplane and get ready for the low-speed taxi test. Double check that you complied with all the details in the pre-flight checkout before you go on to taxi test. Okay, we've now completed the weight and balance, of course, the systems check of the airplane, and we've run the engine with the cowling off and have checked the temperatures and the carburetor heat and so on. Now we've got the airplane for the first time in a condition that's ready to fly. It has the cowling on, it's all buttoned up, everything under the cowling has been checked and secured, and we're going to run the engine for the first time with the cowling on and in a flight airworthy condition. Mike's going over and checking every last-minute detail to make sure that the oil's right, making sure that the controls are functioning, and a last-minute check to make sure things can't hang up with each other, and to make sure the bolts are safetied, and the landing gear is in good shape, and the brakes aren't leaking, and all the fluids he goes through and checks. Going through the regular pre-flight checklist for the airplane. Includes all the control surfaces, rudder return spring, stops, security of the hinges on the aileron, tightness of all the bolts, checking that the exhaust system is secure, the cowling itself is secured. Before putting on the cowling, we torqued up the propeller. The torque of a wooden propeller is extremely important to keep it on the airplane. Otherwise, it can vibrate. The bolts can, if the bolts are slightly loose, the propeller can be taken off during flight. is a normal checklist for the pre-flight. Okay, Mike's also looking at the overall structure to make sure that it's smooth and there's no indication of cracks or debonds or bubbles. He's checking the fuel tanks and for any evidence of leakage, and the canopy hinges. Fuel cap, make sure it's secured and locked. Make sure there's no binding fit of the canopy. Also, each elevator hinge needs to be checked for the appropriate edge distance, the tightness of the bolt, and the minimum number of 2 extra screws on the outside of the locking nut. Canard for security. Inside the hatch there, we previously checked the brake pedals. He's checking the pitot tube for make sure it's clear. The static source on the other side to make sure that it's open, and the other elevator. An important check is the again the fuel cap over there. He's draining the fuel tank. Drains, leading edge drains. Check for evidence of water or sediment. And we go up and check the canopy latches. All the canopy latches for security, and the canopy hooks inside the fuselage for security and good clearance and good fit. He'll also check that after he gets inside the airplane when he first locks the canopy down. Okay, the checklist is complete, and this is the first time the engine will be run with a cowling on, and we're going to check vibration and go right into the low-speed taxi test. So let's take the airplane and turn it around in the other direction. That's good. Mike will give the engine a couple primes, and I'll turn it over once where the switch is off. Switch is off. Okay, switch is on. Cut. A low-speed taxi, as defined, as that speed slower than required to lift the nose wheel off the ground. And that's about 40 miles an hour. The new pilot should spend at least a full hour doing low-speed taxi to thoroughly familiarize himself with the cockpit environment and to thoroughly check the engine, the brakes, the controls, the landing gear, and so on. 35 knots is sufficient speed to evaluate rudder steering and brake effectiveness. You may find that extensive taxiing can overheat the brakes. At 35 knots, you'll notice that a floppy feel of the control stick is gone, and the air loads now provide a comfortable centering feel. Mike is doing just the real low-speed taxi now, where he's checking the steering of the brakes, checking the friction of the nose wheel, checking his ability to straighten the brakes, and checking really the smoothness of the landing gear and the smoothness of the engine, and spending an hour or so to really thoroughly familiarize himself with the cockpit environment. 35 knots is sufficient speed to evaluate rudder steering and brake effectiveness. You may find that extensive taxiing can overheat the brakes. It's generally best to do the initial taxiing with the wheel pants off to keep the brakes from overheating. At 35 knots, you will note that the floppy feel of the control stick is gone, and air loads now provide a comfortable centering feel. After the low-speed taxiing, you should recheck that your weight and balance was within the first flight box on the diagram on page 30. Recheck wing and canard incidents and control travel and freedom before proceeding. Now is the time for the final FAA inspection and issuance of the airworthiness certificate before you proceed to the high-speed taxi and first flights. Wind conditions should be less than 5 or 6 knots and the wind straight down the runway. Never attempt initial testing with any type of crosswind at all. Okay, before conducting the following tests with your new Long Easy, do all of them first with 2 other different airplanes in which you're proficient. These maneuvers, the nose wheel liftoffs at low power, are a little strange to the average pilot. Do them in a familiar airplane to take the strangeness out of the maneuver and better prepare you for doing them in a new airplane. It also gives you a first-hand look at the runway length requirements and wind conditions. Some of the following requirements and procedures may seem excessive. These are not due to any special feature of the Long Easy. We feel they should be required of any home built during their initial testing. The safety record of home builts during first flights is not as good as it could be if the owners and pilots would follow the following cautious procedures during initial testing. Weather. Wind calm or smooth wind conditions straight down the runway. Smooth air. Check turbulence in another airplane. Runway, at least 3,500 feet, preferably over 4,000 feet. Fuel, 10 gallons in each tank. Pilot experience requirements. Check for absolute minimum criteria. Do not test fly a new airplane while fatigued. Go home, get some dinner, sleep. You're more alert in the morning. The reason for the long runway requirement is to allow you to do nose wheel liftoffs and decelerations without concern for stopping distance or brake heating. The air must be smooth and without crosswind. Check the pitch trim for takeoff. Set neutral roll trim. The purpose of this phase of testing is to evaluate the airplane's performance and trim during a high-speed taxi and nose wheel liftoff to acquaint the pilot with the pitch and yaw characteristics of the Long Easy, and more importantly, to give them the correct visual cue of zero height to allow him to judge flare height on his first landing. The pilot should spend enough time just below rotation speed to be thoroughly proficient and comfortable with a unique Long Easy rudder system. There should be no tendency for the pilot to inadvertently push or deploy both rudders at the same time unless during braking. The next step is to practice speed control before attempting nose wheel liftoffs. It's important to be able to control speed accurately so as not to get airborne inadvertently. You will find that once the speed is attained, it takes very little power to maintain it. Practice accelerating to and maintaining different target speeds. We're accelerating up to now about 45 miles an hour, about 40 knots. Do not rotate. You'll notice that Mike will be moving the flight controls and checking that the airplane's responsiveness and roll and pitch, even though it's not rotating. You will find that once the target speed is reached, you must reduce power to idle or just a hair above it to keep from exceeding the target speed. Be proficient and comfortable in holding the speed before moving on to nose wheel liftoffs. Find what power it requires to stay right at 45 or 40 miles an hour. Check the ailerons, roll them back and forth to check for pitch and roll feel of the airplane. Notice he's rocking the ailerons now and rocking the wings. The aircraft will rotate at different speeds depending on gross weight and center of gravity. To To determine rotation speed, accelerate to 40 knots, set the power to maintain speed, then attempt to rotate. If 40 knots is too slow, then go back to the start and try 45 knots. And the next run we'll go to 45 knots.
Okay, we get ourselves lined up, lined up on the center line, get the nose wheel straight, bring up the power smoothly, accelerate to about 50. Power comes in.
We're now accelerating to 50 knots to see if it's sufficient to raise the nose. Once at that speed and once at that target speed, there's the nose off.
Let the nose come off. The nose starts to slowly rise off. I hold the nose so that the canard is not too high. The canard's getting a little high there.
Practice raising the nose. The canard above the horizon is way too high. Speed up just a little bit. Okay, that's too much. Just a slight bit. Practice holding the nose at a desired position. The nose is just slightly off the ground now. Practice rolling rocking the wings back and forth with the nose wheel off to get the feel of the roll control. Do several of these runs to make sure that you're very proficient at holding the nose exactly where you want it.
And the airplane felt real good on that run. There's absolutely no tendency for it to roll one way or the other. We got plenty of authority with the elevator as far as forward and back. Back on the stick, we'll pitch the airplane up. Push forward on it, and the nose will come right down again, so we know we have enough authority. Okay.
Once you've done enough runs down the runway so that you can comfortably, smoothly, and precisely control the speed, the pitch, and the yaw with the nose wheel off the ground, you should be ready for first flight. You should be proficient in rudder operations and positive control of pitch control, and you should be ready then for the big one. Be sure to review and understand the following. The Long Easy does not fly like a Cessna 150 or some other sluggish trainer. The Long Easy is a high-performance, responsive airplane with differences. It has a side stick controller, and the pilot should keep his forearm on the armrest and use his wrist to control pitch. Also, the rudders can both be deployed simultaneously, and the pilot should be careful not to inadvertently deploy both of them in flight. There are two differences in a Long Easy that must be thoroughly understood prior to flight. One is the non-standard rudder pedals. Be sure not to inadvertently deploy both rudders at the same time by pressing hard on both feet. If this happens, one will usually be out more than the other, producing unwanted yaw. The Long Easy rudders are quite effective. Adjust the pedals so your foot does not press the pedals naturally. The second thing is pitch over-controlling. The novice pilot will expect the Long Easy to handle like a Cessna 150 or whatever he last flew. The experienced pilot knows that J3 Cubs and Bonanzas handle considerably differently and will make the transition quite easily. Spend enough time on the runway just above rotation speed but below liftoff speed, and practice controlling pitch so that you can put and hold the desired pitch attitude correctly. Hold the forearm on the armrest and control pitch with a wrist only. Do not over-rotate. The highest rotation you should see during this or later flights is with the canard up but never above the horizon. Better yet, always keep the canard at least 2 degrees below the horizon. Remember, the first flight of your aircraft is just one baby step up from the liftoff that you've just completed and is just the bare beginning of your flight test program. First flight should again be made under ideal weather conditions. The weight and CG position should be within the limited envelope for initial flights. First flight is not intended to demonstrate the capability of your aircraft or of the pilot and should be flown very conservatively. Leave the gear down and give yourself one less thing to worry about. Limit your airspeed from 70 knots to 130 knots. Stay over the airport and resist the urge to buzz your observers. Buzz jobs on first flights are done by fools, never by professional test pilots. During your climb out, set the pitch and roll trims to trim the airplane for hands-off flight. This will be a handy reminder of trim direction if the airplane needs adjustment. you will notice a small roll trim change when you reduce the power. The airplane will require more right trim with power off. Limit your first flight to feeling out the roll, pitch, and yaw responses and checking the engine operation, temperatures, pressures, and so on. And make your approach for landing at 75 knots and make a slightly fast touchdown, 65 to 70 knots, leaving the slower landings for later in the test program. Okay, we're going to accelerate now for the first flight. This will be actually easier than doing the nose wheel liftoff tests. You don't have speed control to worry about. You just give it full throttle. When the nose wheel will rotate, the airplane will... You get to flying speed and the airplane will just lift off and climb on out.
Okay, now we're going to be making our first landing. And we check for traffic. We got no traffic and altitude looks good, everything looks good. We get the airplane down here to about 80 knots. It's about 90 miles an hour on left base. The one thing you have to watch with your new Long Easy is the airplane is a very good glider, and you do have to be on speed in order to be able to land the airplane. Okay, no traffic. We're looking good, and we're turning final, and we're indicating 75 knots. And verify that we got the gear down. Of course, on our first flight, we did not lift the gear, did not raise the gear at all. That's just one more thing to have to worry about. Just verify that the gear is down or not. The gear is down. And now here we are on short final. We're holding 70, 75 knots. Let's carry enough power to give us the speed we need.
And make a slightly fast touchdown, about 65 knots. Just let the airplane drive onto the ground and leave your full stall landings for later on in the test program. This is the easiest way to land the airplane, and it's very, very stable on the ground after touchdown. With the first flight completed and any squawks resolved, you are ready to expand your flight envelope. Do not promptly charge out and test fly your aircraft at the extreme CG positions and weights. Expand your envelope in small increments. Remember, you have 40 hours for your test area, so put the time to good use and do a professional job of flight testing. Before expanding the weight and CG range shown for initial testing, spend a few hours and become thoroughly comfortable in your piloting tasks. When you feel at home in the airplane, begin your expansion of the weight, CG position, load factor, and airspeed ranges. Don't feel obliged to expand into the full ranges. Expand your limitations slowly, and if you reach a point you feel uncomfortable, stop. Some general words of caution. Wear a parachute for your flight testing. Never leave a squawk unresolved. Find and fix problems as you encounter them. Airplanes usually give a hint of impending problem. The problem is pilots don't always listen. If something changes, a slight roughness, a vibration, a new oil leak, a trim change, new squeak, and so on, look until you find it. Don't rationalize it away. And have bunches of fun.